Chapter 3. Koilos. Mishra was correct. There were drawings in the sand of the deeper desert to the west of their encampment. They were large figures made from raised mounds of dry earth, darker than their surroundings, and best visible from the air. Terisiare had conducted earlier expeditions in that very area before settling on the present site of the encampment, but never guessed their true nature. The drawings were an odd mixture. There were humanoid figures of every type, any one of which might be the representation of a Thran. There were also all manner of animals, deer, elephants, and camels. There was an odd collection of geometric symbols, curves, spirals, and sharp angles that crossed and recrossed their gathered figures, bisecting some, leaving others untouched. Doodles, thought Terisiare, created by a race of desert titans. The drawings were of Thran origins, of course, as Mishra had guessed. They were arrayed around a single location, a large mound. This proved to be a rich field of artifacts, including an almost complete Suchi skeleton that finally fulfilled Terisiare's dream of putting together one of the enigmatic beasts. There were also the remains of several ornithopters. Yet the discovery of the Suchi and ornithopters was secondary to the rich trove of power crystals found in the central mound. Many of the crystals were cracked or expired, but there were among the dross more than enough operational remains, vibrant, lambent jewels that glittered with a rainbow of sparks and patterns within. There were more than enough of the jewels for Terisiare to keep for her own work, with sufficient surplus to send to other scholars and various noble supporters in the capital of Pendragon. This in turn supplied enough interest from the nobility to allow her to open a second permanent camp at the site of Mishra's find. The discovery of the drawings in the deserts was made possible by airborne observation. The same method revealed similar drawing fields, though none as large or intact as the first. An arc of them extended into the desert in a broad sweep outward from the Kh ridges. Some of the drawings had figures of recognizable races, while others did not. All contained a stylized pattern of curves and zigzagged lines around a central mound containing wrecked artifacts and power stones. During the next 2 years, researchers located almost 20 such mounds. Still, the big questions eluded Terisiare and the brothers. No one found any skeletal remains of the Thran themselves, nor any art. The archaeologists discovered nothing of their language more than a few fragments that seemed little more than labels and an obvious set of numerical symbols. At dinner, the scholar, the two brothers, and some of the elder students were accustomed to discuss the Thran's possible nature. They had to be human, said Urza in the course of one such talk. Everything we have found is capable of being used by human-sized individuals. They were probably a successful branch of the early Phalange people that dominated the others through their advanced science. The surviving Phalange of today turned their enterprising brethren into godlike beings. The fact that we're comfortable with the tools doesn't mean anything, disagreed Mishra. Dwarves or elves or orcs could have used these items. Or minotaurs. Minotaurs are too big, said Urza. Their hands would be too large to hold most of the devices. Minotaurs could be in charge, with humans doing the labor. Mishra returned. Terisiare noted that the younger brother refused to concede to his sibling even the smallest point. Imagine, he continued, Minotaurs ruling the Thran nation, and humans as an underclass. Like among the orcs, the big ones are on top, and the Little goblins do all the hard work. We've found no Minotaur remains, brother, said Urza coolly. We've found no human remains either, brother, Mishra shot back, raising his glass of nabbers in a mock toast to his own logic. Terisiare leaned back in her chair, recently arrived from the capital, a comfortable, cushioned affair, and let the two brothers spar. This was an old argument, revisited at least once a month. It always ended the same way, in an admission that they did not know enough. That confession always seemed to frustrate both of the young men. Both of the brothers had changed over the years of discovery. Urza was leaner than ever, though he finally had a good set of shoulders. His face was smooth, and he prided himself on not losing his temper as he had when he was a child. Mishra, for his part, was as impulsive as he had been the day of that first fight. His most obvious change was a sparse dark beard that framed his smiling mouth. The older students at the table watched the argument as well, but did not get involved. Urza and Mishra were older than most of the students now, and in another few years they would be thought of as adults in their own right. The noble students had learned early that voicing a contrary opinion when the two were fighting like this was a sure way to turn both young men against their interloper. Terisiare was proud of the boys and their achievements, and in turn they were devoted to her. But again and again they returned to this single argument and could not move beyond it. They still had not learned the identity of the Thran. As the young men's voices rose higher, Terisiare leaned forward, hoping to turn the brothers to a new tack. "Why haven't we?" she interrupted. Both young men blinked at the older scholar as she repeated, "Why haven't we found any remains, human or otherwise?" "Scavengers," said Mishra immediately. Urza made a rude noise. "Then why haven't we found any scavenger remains?" he asked scornfully. "There are no dead creatures of any type among the wreckage. There should be some, even by accident." "And you have a theory, brother?" asked Mishra. "Plague," said Urza calmly. "Something swept through that knot. Only killed the Thran but destroyed their remains as well. That also explains why the wreckage is so widely scattered." Mishra shook his head. "Not plague. War. Plague wouldn't explain why there is no art. War would. The victors burned what? Could burn paintings, books, bodies. Then they destroyed the rest. We have found ash pits among the various sites. Those are the result of manufacture, not battle," observed Urza. "And if you're right, what became of the victors?" "They became the scavengers," retorted Mishra triumphantly, setting down his glass. "That's what it has to be. A slave race of humans that destroyed the Minotaur masters, then fell apart itself without the Minotaur science to support them." Urza chuckled. "A perfect argument. Each point uses as proof another questionable point, which eventually requires you to believe what you were trying to prove in the first place. So, brother, why didn't these scavenger survivors create any art after the war?" Mishra frowned slightly, considering. "They hadn't reached the point of gaining art," he said finally. "So there is no art from the period." "Except for the drawings in the desert," said Urza. "Except for the drawings in the desert," agreed his brother. "Except they aren't, you know," said Urza with a small smile. Mishra shook his head, looking puzzled. "Those are not drawings in the desert. Nothing natural could produce." "Those are not art," interrupted Urza. "Oh, the humanish figures might be, or they may simply be a recognition of other races the Thran had met. But all the lines, angles, and squiggles, those are not art. They are instructions. Terisiare stared at Urza, intrigued as well. What had he discovered now? Urza rose from the table and left the top without saying another word. He returned with a large map of the area, which he shook open over the table. The other students moved quickly to save the remains of the broiled desert hare and cantaloupe that would otherwise be covered by the sheet. The map showed the arc of ruins they had uncovered. Here are the locations of the various Thran outposts we have found, he said, jabbing a thin finger against the map. He followed from one to another, following the curve of wreckage. At each location, the collection of odd angles and lines seems to point in one direction. From our second encampment, it points slightly west of due north. Producing a stylus, the blonde student sketched a practiced line extending north. In the next one, farther west, a majority of lines also indicate a particular direction, this one slightly more northerly than the first, he said, drawing another strong arrow straight line. And the next shows yet another line, almost due north in direction, the next points north and slightly east. And so on for each of the discovered sites so far. The stylus scratched out a number of new lines. Urza stood back from the map so the others could see. The ruins were in an arc, as everyone knew, but the lines Urza had sketched all pointed to one particular location, the center of a circle, of which the ruined mounds were points along the perimeter. The Thran were not an artistic people, said Urza, looking at his brother. Why then leave art in the desert? The answer is, they did not. They left instructions. Instructions about where their larger settlements were. We saw the figures, which we recognized, and ignored the lines, which we did not. But the lines are more important. Mishra leaned over the map and scowled. Lines on paper, he snorted. You saw the arc and calculated the center, then looked for justification in the lines of the various mounds. So you disagree with my argument, brother? Asked Urza quietly. Mishra smiled, the whiteness of his teeth sharp against the surrounding beard. But I love your argument, brother. It's perfect. Each point uses as proof another questionable point, which eventually requires you to believe what you are trying to prove in the first place. The argument I love. It's your conclusions I think are wrong. Urza rolled up his map slowly. I suppose that means you don't want to come along tomorrow when I go find out. Mishra started, and even Terisiare looked sharply at the elder brother. With your permission, mistress, I would like to take an ornithopter out to check this out, Urza said. Since my brother does not wish to accompany me, I can manage with one of the smaller craft. I didn't say I wouldn't go, interrupted Mishra sharply. In fact, I think I should go along, if only to keep you from seeing ruins that are not there. Urza nodded with a determined smile. Then he ducked from beneath the top and strode into the growing dusk. I have plans to make then, he called over his shoulder. Evening, all. In Urza's wake the dinner table was silent. None of the other students wanted to comment on Urza's theory, and Terisiare needed time to digest what the older brother had said. Tentatively, the conversation returned to more mundane matters. One student ventured that his area of the dig was producing some interesting discs marked with Thran numerals. Another mentioned that his work was being delayed by a junior student that declared every uprooted rock to be some artifact of the ancient race. That brought a small laugh from the others and from Takesha, a tale of one student a few years before who thought that they should dig on mountain tops because if she were one of the Thran, that's where she'd leave the most valuable items. Mishra sat quietly just beyond the firelight and stroked his stubbled beard. After a few minutes he excused himself as well and left the table. He did not head for the quarters he shared with Urza, but rather turned down toward where the Phalange diggers made the camp. Takesha noticed that the younger brother had a worried look on his face, but at the time she paid it little mind. That evening, after the dishes had been cleared, Takesha worked on a suchi leg assembly at her table. The design that they had discovered in the almost complete specimen was different than either Urza or she had anticipated. It was almost, she thought, as if the legs were mounted backward, the knees pointing toward the rear. Was this a design choice of the Thran, she wondered, or was this a model of their real appearance? A shadow appeared at the entrance of the top, and she looked up suddenly as Armel entered. Old Armel as he was known now. She reminded herself his hair had turned grey in rivulets along either side of his face. Lately he had been complaining that his age was finally catching up with him. Takesha knew he was a grandfather, and someday soon he would leave the encampment. Takesha would miss him, for he represented all she felt was admirable among the Phalange people. He was direct, forthright, and honest. Now, from the stern look on his face, Takesha got the feeling she was about to get a messy dose of the last quality. I hear your young men are flying into the mountains on the morrow, he said, his desert accent still thick after all these years among the Argivians. How did Takesha started, then realized where Armel got his information. Mishra would have asked him about the Ring of Ruins and the center point of the arc that Urza had located. And that news had obviously disturbed the elder Phalange. She nodded and motioned toward a camp chair. The old leader of the diggers sat himself carefully down upon it, as if either he or the chair would break from the experience. Urza has some ideas about finding the wreckage of a large Thran settlement there. Old Armel looked at the worn, dusty carpeting beneath his feet. I do not think it is a good idea. The Phalange would frown on it. Takesha knit her brow. Armel and his diggers had never expressed the idea of taboo land before. Indeed, in most of the tribal settlements she had visited, the inhabitants were exceedingly proud to show off, if not actively trade, the Thran artifacts they had discovered. Not all the Phalange, Armel continued. He looked up quickly at her, as if he could read her thoughts in her eyes. Most of us are modern enough, are wise enough to know there is nothing in the mountains that is not in the desert. But there are those who are concerned about the spirits of the Thran, about their heart. It is said that the secret heart lies in the mountains, and we Phalange stay well clear of them. Armel, said Takesha gently, you have never mentioned anything like this before, nor complained about our previous digs. That is because it is in the desert, and the desert belongs to all who can endure her, said Armel. The Phalange claim all this land, but are willing to share it with others who respect it. The high mountains, however, the inner mountains themselves, are dangerous, and not only for the great RUQ birds found there. We claim them as Phalange territory, but we do not visit them. nor do we recommend others do so. Argive claims those mountains as well, thought Terisiare, though she did not voice that opinion. Most of the Argivians were coastal people to begin with, and the broad expanses claimed by the noble factions were just lines on a map. If we are violating some taboo, she began. Armel held up a hand. Not a taboo exactly, mistress. A desire. A concern. Most of the diggers do not believe the stories of the herd mothers. But some do, and they may make things difficult. Haja, my own assistant, believes in genies, ghouls, and the great dragons, the Makfawars, that haunt the night. Armel, said Terisiare, smiling slightly, you know that. Standing in either brother's way when he has determined to do something is like trying to turn aside the desert wind. They will go looking. And now that you have brought me your concern, I will go with them. My question for you is, should we find something and need to investigate further, will you come along as well to aid us? Old Armel sat bolt upright, surprised. Terisiare had phrased the question just right short of an insulting accusation, but direct enough to demand an answer. He sputtered for a moment, then turned stern again. I will be wherever you need me to be, he said coldly. I have learned more about the ancient days from working with you than I would in a lifetime of roaming the desert. We have moved too much earth, you and I, for us to part ways over a grandmother story. Terisiare allowed herself a small grin, then turned a stern face to the old man. Go, then, and find out among your diggers who believes in grandmother stories and who does not. Discover who would go to a dig site in the mountains and who would remain. Do not challenge the pride or the courage, for then even those who think it sacrilege would come along and feel the worse for it. I do not know if we will find anything, but if we do, we will investigate it. Armel nodded and rose to his feet. I did not think you would shy away from any challenge, Terisiare. You are like a man in that regard. Terisiare rose as well in respect. I did not think you would hide any information I needed to know from me. Thank you. Armel bowed and was gone. Terisiare shook her head as she watched his shadow join the others of the early evening. You are like a man, he had said, and meant it as a compliment. Typical desert dweller after all these years. Yet he was still willing to defy old stories and give her a warning. Terisiare shook her head again and returned to intricacies of the Suchi's leg mechanisms. They left the next morning, packing enough rations for a day and a half's flight out and back. Both of the young men accepted Terisiare's companionship without comment, and neither suggested that she not come along. She left Kantar, one of the more promising older students of that season, in charge while she was gone, and told him not to argue with Armel or Haja and to defer any disputes or major decisions until they returned. The ornithopter was the original one they had rebuilt years ago. Now the forward housing was enclosed by a larger wooden frame containing more than enough room for the three explorers and the supplies. The control levers remained in the middle of the housing, so either young man could handle them. The power of the stone was nearly inexhaustible, but human flesh was otherwise. After about 4 hours of flight, they would have to change operators. From the ground, the borders of the Great Desert were a low, undulating waste of blown dust marred with frequent rocky outcroppings. The region was barren, claimed by the coastal states with intermittent and vague borders far inland. The Phalange also claimed the wastes, but they enforced that title only when seeking to shake down a few valuables from merchants and explorers in the desert. It seemed an inhospitable and barren world. From aloft it was transformed. The rocky spires became sentinels, marking the passage of time as their shadows swept beneath them. The deep and uncrossable canyons turned into rainbows of colored granite and sandstone. The dry lakes were transformed into glittering patches of salt. The desert wind plucked at their ornithopters' control wires as they sailed effortlessly northward. With Urza at the controls, they flew straight across the sky, fixed on the course that he had set. Occasionally he called out to Mishra to check the coordinates. Inevitably, after checking with map and compass and taking a reading on the sun, the younger brother declared all was well. Each time Urza nodded as if he would be surprised by any other result. When Mishra was piloting, they roamed more, still keeping to the general north and slightly west direction, but wandering back and forth along that line. If an interesting formation caught Mishra's eye, he steered toward it until Urza warned him they were off course. Then the younger brother sighed and brought the prow of the craft back on track. Occasionally they had to re-engage the wings to regain lost altitude. Then Urza would check 3 times to make sure of their position. Once they passed over another series of lines. These held no humanoid figures, only spirals and angles juxtaposed against one another. Mishra circled the site as the older brother sketched, then nodded in confirmation. The angles pointed in the direction they should travel. At the end of the first day they sat down on a particularly high mesa, far from the protection of the stockade and its grape-shot catapults. They camped without a fire and slept within the ornithopter's housing, though Takasia had not had to mounder control levers during the flight. She was worn by the continual motion. Her head ached from the tinny rush of the wind over the wires. She slept without dreams that evening and awoke stiff from the cramped quarters. The young men were already outside, Urza stretching to elongate his back, Mishra bending at the knees. After a cold breakfast they set out again. The Thran Center, what Amal had referred to as its secret heart, could not be missed from the air, though it would not be reached easily from the ground. It was at the end of a long, winding canyon leading west, the trail of some ancient long-dead river that had split the low mesa and cradled the ruins. And ruins they were, long processions of shattered building foundations and tumbled walls. Some of the ruins resembled manor houses from Argive. Others were akin to the onion dome temples of distant Tomikul. Still others resembled nothing the 3 investigators had seen before: a framework of metal that supported nothing at all, a pile of discarded plates, each the size of a man, with serrated edges, or a tangle of what looked like blue metallic worms. Along the far canyon wall was what looked like a nest of broken bronze-colored spiders. The entire cavalcade of wreckage was buried beneath the sands carried out of the desert to the west. "Do you doubt my calculations now, brother?" said Urza with a smile. "Only a fool would doubt his own eyes." "Well done, brother," said Mishra, his grin even wider. "The Thran's secret heart," murmured Takasia. Mishra flinched slightly at the phrase and his smile faded, but Urza only nodded. "The old Argivian word for secret was koilos," said Urza. Let that be the name of this hidden land. Circle around it. Brother. We can best see the lay of the land from up here. Mishra nodded and was just pulling on the controls when suddenly a shadow passed over the ornithopter housing. It could have been a cloud but for the fact that the desert sky was clear. Terisiare knew what it meant. She shouted at the same moment that Mishra pitched the flying craft into a steep, banking dive. Urza was taken by surprise and let out a curse as he was flung against the inner side of the craft's housing. The rock dove through the space that moments ago had been occupied by the ornithopter. The bird was a huge representative of its race, a species reputed in old legends to snatch elephants for the plains for supper. Nearly 3 times the size of the ornithopter, its passage almost flipped the craft. The rock recovered as soon as it had passed, gaining altitude quickly to make another dive at the craft. "Why is it attacking?" shouted Urza. "We're large and we're moving," replied Terisiare, screaming above the wind. "It probably thinks we're another rock." Mishra cursed and pulled both levers back as far as they would go. "I don't think we can get above it. It's too fast for us." The rock was already over them again, making another dive. Mishra re-engaged the wings and jinked the craft to the right, but the rock was ready for the maneuver. It shifted slightly. There was a horrendous rip along the right side, and Terisiare saw that one of the wing struts had been ripped loose and was now fluttering in the wind. Better than the entire wing missing, thought Terisiare, but enough to cripple them. "We can't outfly it," yelled Mishra. "I'm going to put us down over there," shouted Urza, pointing to the nest of broken metal spiders. "I think there's a hole in the cliff wall." "Won't make it," shouted Mishra, pulling first one lever, then the other, trying to shake the rock off the tail. "That's because you're flying like a bird," snapped Urza, shoving his brother aside and grabbing the control levers himself. "Fly like a machine and we'll make it." Under Urza's control, the craft no longer zigzagged across the sky but instead rocketed forward, swooping low over the wrecked landscape of Koilos. The rock, its simple avian brain, expecting the craft to act like another flyer, expected it to dodge or to turn. The bird hesitated before pursuing. Its indecision was all the time that the 3 needed. Urza charged the cliff wall. Mishra shouted in panic. Terisiare suddenly remembered a prayer she had learned as a child back in temple school when temples were still fashionable in Argive. She muttered the words softly as the far wall closed on them. Suddenly Urza banked, bringing the prow of the craft up. He unlocked the mechanism that held the wings in position, and they automatically began to fold. Without the support, the craft plummeted. Again, the rock passed through empty space that moments ago had housed the flyer. Urza dropped about 50 feet, then re-engaged the wing locks. The wings spread out immediately, catching the desert air and slowing their fall. Still, they landed with an unceremonious bump on the sand. Had they landed on rock, Terisiare had no doubt they would have broken the supporting struts, not to mention a few bones. Urza unlatched the wing locks, and the wings folded inward. Again, the damaged strut sticking out at an odd angle. Terisiare was already at the hatch, scanning the skies. "It'll be back," she said, scanning the empty heavens. "Let's not be here when it comes." "Shouldn't take off again immediately anyway," said Urza. "It might be waiting. Besides, we need to get the strut repaired." Let's make for that cavern entrance. Are you all right, brother? You should care, said Mishra hotly as Terisiare turned at the hatch, afraid the young man had been hurt. I knew what I was doing. You didn't need to shove yourself into things. Urza blinked and scowled, his concern replaced with irritation. You were playing its game, flying like another rock. Of course it could outfly you that way. We only lost it because I made for shelter now. Argument later, Terisiare broke in sharply. And bring the torches and water. We might be here until dark. Neither brother replied, but neither argued with the old scholar. They clambered up the sandy bank behind her, breaking into a full-fledged run as the rock's shadow passed over them. Terisiare was at the entrance first. She spun and scanned the heavens. Above them, the rock circled the canyon of broken machinery and wrecked buildings. We'll have to bring the catapults with us next time, she said. Or figure out a way to mount him on an ornithopter, observed Mishra. We're going to be here for a while, said Urza. Should we see where this passage goes? The cavern was an entranceway. The first 10 feet or so were natural rock, but after that the sandstone gave way to smooth, polished granite. Terisiare ran her hands along the wall. It was constructed of separate blocks, invisible to the eye, detectable as individual stones only by touch. She whistled a low note. Even among the Thran ruins she had excavated, there was no workmanship this precise. Behind her, Mishra lit the candlewood torches. The guttering flames smoked, but were better than no light at all. It was fortunate you saw this opening, said Terisiare to Urza. It was obvious, he returned, taking a torch from his brother. The wreckage of the buildings indicated roads, all of which radiated from this spot. This is the center of the Thran's supposed secret heart. Single quote quote. The heart of the heart, said Terisiare. They spoke in whispers, as if their words might wake the long dead. Terisiare tried to raise her voice to a normal level, but the very emptiness of the space defeated her. Mishra examined the corridor before them. No creatures live here. Look at the dust. No footprints but our own. Urza held up his torch, the light flaring from the walls. And no bats, either. Nothing has been here for a long time. Both young men looked at Terisiare. Right then, she said at last. Forward. But stay together and stick to the main path. There was little worry, for the few openings to either side were mere alcoves, and the cavern ran straight back into the hillside itself. They passed several sets of stairs and one or two large chambers, but nothing that would indicate any occupants, recent or otherwise. Dead crystalline plates dotted the ceiling above them, reflecting the light of the torches but providing none of their own. The first alcoves were empty, but as they moved forward, Terisiare noticed some were filled with the remains of Suchi constructs. These were rusted relics, little better than the ones they had pulled from the dig. Several were nothing more than lower torsos, the upper halves lost to time or perhaps to tomb robbers. Terisiare noticed with some satisfaction that the knees of creatures did indeed bend backward. They had reached another staircase leading down into the darkness when they heard it, or rather, felt it. A deep throbbing came from within the surrounding stone, as if the earth were humming some unknowable ditty. Terisiare looked at the young men. They stared at each other, and the scholar was once again reminded of the silent communication they seemed to share. Then the brothers looked back at Terisiare and nodded. The three descended toward the noise. Ahead there was light, no more than a grey smudge against the blackness. It slowly refined itself, growing with each passing step. There were no more Suchi alcoves now, only straight walls leading toward the goal. They entered a chamber as large as any they had passed through. The walls were natural, but supported with ancient steel and pillars of the same closely set blocks that Terisiare had seen earlier. The walls were littered with machines. They were clearly of Thran design, but with a difference. These appeared functional. Their cogs were greased and shining, the surfaces polished and mirror-like in their finish. It was, Terisiare thought, as if the Thran had left only moments before. There were lights as well. Within this chamber the ceiling plates were alight with their own ambient glow. Small balls of radiance danced around some of the machinery, orbiting them like small, glowing moons. But this was all outdone by the large crystal in the center. It was a power stone, unmarred by age and unbroken by accident. Its facets were smooth and reflective, the edges sharp enough to cut the fabric of reality itself. It was about the size of two human fists. Yet it called to Terisiare's mind the image of two hearts, for it pulsed with its own rhythm. A rainbow of colors played across it as it throbbed with life. The power stone was on a low platform flanked by mirrors, which in turn were attached by wires to various machines around the perimeter. The power stone might be responsible for nothing more than the lights, the archaeologist noted, or it might be a fully operational machine with a greater purpose. Before the power stone's pedestal was a smooth bank of metal, shaped like an oversized open book. Its pages were metal and glass, and the glass winked like an evil eye in the night. Never had Terisiare seen a device like this one. She realized this might have come at the end of the cycle of Thran development. Perhaps what they had been excavating so lovingly were nothing more than old scrapyards, where the ancient and unwanted remnants of the Thran's past were discarded. She stared at the crystal itself, while the two young men moved ahead of her, drawn by its incandescent radiance. They stood before the open metal book, dwarfed by its size and magnificence. Their voices rattled against the walls of the cave, rebounding and gaining strength from the subliminal hum that surrounded them. "It's beautiful," said Mishra. "Look how it glows." "It's intact," said Urza. "Think what we can learn." "These markings," said Mishra, spreading his hands out toward the metal book glyphs. "They're so much like the Thran writings we've seen, but more detailed, more advanced." "Don't touch anything," called Urza sharply, thrusting out his own hand to intercept his brother's. "We don't know what they do." Terisiare could not tell which brother was responsible for what happened next. She could not tell which brother touched the particular glyph, or even if either did. Later, neither brother admitted to anything, and each accused the other of causing the disaster. All Terisiare could say was that as Urza reached out to stop his brother, the glow intensified suddenly and hotly. There was an explosion, but one without sound, and a huge power stone, the heart of the secret heart, shattered in a blossom of light. Chapter 4. Visions. This is what Terisiare saw. The power stone at the center of the room suddenly began to glow hotter, to consume itself with its own radiance. It shone as if a piece of the sun itself had been detached and set down among them. Instinctively Terisiare flung her arms up in front of her to shield her eyes, but already the two brothers were nothing more than fuzzy silhouettes against the gem's radiance. She shouted out the names, but her voice was swallowed by the explosion. There was an explosion, though its sound was in wavelengths that she could not hear. It resounded through the length of the caverns and rattled every bone in her body. There was pressure, as if a great hand was pressing down upon her, then pressing through her, leaving her standing. There was heat, as if she had suddenly passed through a furnace. Then the heat was gone as well. And finally there was a rush of air from behind her, as if the world was straining to fill the gap of what had been lost. It was the force of the blow from behind, unanticipated and unexpected, that knocked her to her knees. She stumbled to her feet, her ancient joints complaining, her eyes still seared by the brilliance of the power stone's immolation. The stone was no longer on its pedestal, and the deep humming of the cavern no longer resounded through her bones. Terisiare blinked back the brilliance. Slowly her sight returned, first at the perimeter of her vision, then slowly returning to the center of her eyes. She blinked back a sheen of new sprung tears, and with it the last bits of her blindness. The pedestal was empty. The power stone was gone. Both of the young men were on the floor, but already staring. Neither had been hurt physically by the blast as far as she could tell, but they pulled themselves up like old men, careful not to shatter their own bones by rising. Then she noticed that the power stone was not gone. It had been split in two, and each of the brothers held half in his left hand. More of the lights came on in the cavern, and she heard the tramp of metal feet against stone. This is what Urza saw. He was reaching out to stop Mishra, but was too late. There was a brilliant flash that consumed him both. His last clear vision was of his brother's face, his expression surprise, his beard surrounding an open mouth, shouting a curse or a warning. Urza could not hear him, and suddenly he was surrounded by the whiteness of the blast. Then he was somewhere else. He was floating, flying over a landscape that he had never seen before. The earth beneath him was made of cables of corroded metal, crossed and recrossed against themselves until they formed a thick woven mat. Huge gears broke through the metal landscape, turning slowly and straining against the surrounding cables. Copper-colored snakes moved among the mat, but Urza saw that they were instead more cables, blindly seeking their path through the morass of woven wires. There were other great circular plates. Gears turned sideways, as thick as Urza was tall and coated with a thick pattern of corrosion. Urza noticed that the entire landscape was undulating slightly, like a living thing, from the motion of cogs and wheels. Beneath, hills formed around him, moving slowly, pushing the corroded gears relentlessly to his right. In that direction west. He thought, though in this shifting world it was difficult to be sure. There was a reddish glow. Urza landed on one of the gears, and it carried him along as it moved. The mat of copper-colored cables snaked around him but did not touch him. The landscape seemed to boil with metal snakes. There was a storm ahead, ebb and clouds building against the darker surrounding. Blue lightning arched between the clouds, giving them definition. A wave of rain swept over the land. It tasted of oil, but it passed quickly as the shifting hills pushed Urza along. Warm steam leaked from beneath the cables, and there was a brief grinding noise. Then it too ceased. Before Urza, a great tower erupted in the landscape, ripping metal cables and gears as it did so. It was made of thick plates of heavy metal held together by man-sized bolts and covered with angular runes. It pistoned upward, and the gear upon which Urza stood rose and orbited it as it shot up above the undulating hills. Then the tower retracted into the earth as quickly as it had appeared, and the heaving landscape carried Urza forward. There was the sharp sound of insect wings, 1,000 in number. The noise was all around, but the creatures were invisible to his eyes. Then this sound faded as well. Now Urza saw he was no longer alone. There were other beings, standing on another moving disk, one larger than his own. These others were carefully building as they were carried along. They looked humanoid, dressed in radiant white robes from head to toe. Their faces were covered by white masks and their heads by white hoods. Urza concentrated, but they grew no more distinct. All he could see was that they were building something. For the first time Urza became aware that he was dreaming. He should be in a cavern with his brother and mistress Asia, he realized. He held out his hands and counted his fingers. He had always heard that one should do this to determine if one was dreaming. He got the right number of fingers, at least what he thought was the right number, but his flesh was translucent. He judged the experiment inconclusive. The figures in white were moving more quickly now, and he saw they were assembling pieces of a large device made of bronze. It looked like one of the metal spiders at the foot of the cliff, back in the waking world where he had left the ornithopter. This device, though, was no wrecked artifact of another age. It towered over the white figures. If the dream spider was the same size as the wreckage they had seen, Urza determined, then the figures were only slightly shorter than the average human. The dream spider was tall and made of thick plates of bronze colored metal. Blue-white lightning sparked at the device's joints, and it was held together by bolts as thick as Urza's forearm. The device had no head, but from the center of its back rose a large prominence topped by a cylinder. Urza thought of the catapults back in his own world, and recognized the cylinder as a weapon. Looking at the dream spider, Urza saw not only its form but its function. He saw the pylon-like legs and knew how they had been fastened together and how they would therefore have to move. He saw the prominence atop the creature's back and knew it had to be fitted to allow it to spin in any direction. He understood the heavy mass of overlapping plates that formed the creature's armor, and knew how much power was needed to move a mass of that size. The figures in white were talking to each other now. They had seen Urza but evidently did not know what to do about the interloper. Suddenly Urza felt something heavy in his chest, pulsing like a second heart. He looked down. All his flesh was transparent now. Almost without conscious thought, he reached inside himself and pulled out a large gemstone, glittering green, blue, red, white, and black. The colors overlapped one another, seeming to coexist in the same space. The edges of the stone were rough, and Urza knew half of it was missing. He raised the gem and showed it to the figures in white. It seemed sufficient. They immediately forgot about him and returned to their work. The red glow in the west was growing stronger now as the flying gear approached its destination. Looking around, Urza saw Other small white-robed figures on their own sidewise gears, each with their own devices. Some of the machines were spiders. Some were titanic statues. Some seemed to be great elephants or oxen. All were made of the heavy plates of reddish gold metal, and all were armed in the same manner as his spider. Now he saw the glow ahead came from a great foundry, of the type used to make swords and horseshoes. The furnace was made of rough iron and shaped like a monstrous head. Long, curled horns framed a gaping mouth filled with tongues of flickering flame. Urza knew he was a half-mile away from it, but even so he could feel its heat. It could melt the flesh from his bones, he knew. Had he any flesh? A great ramp of red-tinged metal led up to the monster furnace's mouth. The bronze-colored dream spider and the other bronze spiders were moving now, along with the elephants, oxen, and titans. The discs came to rest at the foot of the long ramp, and the various constructs lurched forward, powered by their own internal engines. Steam and sparks leaked from their joints. The artificial creatures formed a pair of lines, one to either side of the ramp. Now the figures in white, the builders of these mighty constructs, began to move as well. Slowly, almost reluctantly, they inched up the ramp. As they moved, the cylindrical weapons atop the reddish gold machines followed them, pacing their approach beneath the barrels. One of the figures nearest to Urza hesitated for a moment, then turned back. Or rather, it tried to. The nearest machine, the golden dream spider the figure had helped build, fired something from its turret. A beam of incandescent light sprang from the tip of the cylinder and cut down the fleeing figure. Urza saw the creature's yellowish bones clatter to the ground and roll to the foot of the ramp. The other figures in white paid no attention to the dead defector. Instead, they slowly made their way up the ramp toward the flames bending beneath the weapons of the gold artifacts. Urza tried to shout a warning, but all he could make was a sound of smithies and ringing hammers. Some of the figures were melting now, while others burst into flame from the heat. The companions urged, dragged, and hauled them forward until they reached the monstrous mouth of the furnace itself. And then they pitched themselves in. Urza screamed. His cries seemed to throw him back away from the monster furnace, away from the world of golden snakes and moving hillsides and beweaponed machines. The furnace's mouth diminished to a small reddish dot as he fled, and he felt something warm behind him. He turned toward the new sensation and woke on the floor of the chamber. He was clutching half of the power stone in his hand. In the distance, Urza heard the tromp of metal feet against stone. This is what Mishra saw. Urza lunged forward, and Mishra looked up at him, but by the time he saw his brother's face, stern and angry, the white glow had already consumed him both. All Mishra saw was Urza's scowl. And then he was someplace else. It was indoors, inside a great hallway. This was unlike the smooth halls bored through the mountain, for the walls seemed to be made of lizard skin, black and pliable. He touched one of the walls, and it flinched. Mishra could see the entire passage ripple, almost as if it were sleeping all around him. The air was thick and moist. The hallway extended ahead of him forever. He turned around. The hallway extended ahead of him forever. He turned around. Again. The hallway extended ahead of him forever. He turned around. One last time and headed down the endless hallway. His foot crunched against something, and he stepped back. Beneath his feet was a small toy made of gold. It was in the shape of a human figure, and irrationally Mishra wondered if Urza was somewhere near. And Terisiare, he remembered Terisiare had been with them just a moment ago. He looked at the figure, but it was no one he recognized. He had inadvertently broken off the figure's arm, and the figure's face was transfixed in a scream. The floor ahead was littered with small screaming figures. Some were humans, but there were elves and orcs, minotaurs and dwarves among them. He tried to move through them without stepping on them, but there were too many. Then he realized that even those figures that he was not stepping on wore screaming visages as well. Reassured that he was doing no additional damage, and that the figurines were probably not alive, he pressed on, scattering the toys in his wake. Now there were alcoves on either side of him, each set with a dark mirror against the back. Mishra stopped at the first one and saw a human form. No, a humanoid form, naked. It seemed to twist as he looked at it, turning first into one race, then another, then a third. It was a statue, shaped from some dark stone, yet fluid. It reached the end of the series of transformations and began the sequence again. Mishra passed to the second mirror and saw another figure. This one was wearing armor, or what seemed to be armor. As it shifted from one form to another, Mishra realized the armor was part of the statue as well, perhaps even a part of the creature that the statue represented. Mishra felt a wave of excitement. Suddenly he knew what the machines back in the cavern were about. They could transform shapes of flesh and stone into other things. They could improve themselves. They could build things. He rushed to the next mirror, ignoring the golden toys at his feet. This was another shape-changing statue, but it had more armor than the one he'd seen previously. It had horns too, splaying backward across the top of its head like an antelope's, not outward like those of a minotaur. It changed shape more slowly, and Mishra saw that the image's flesh had grown leathery, resembling the walls around him. Dark bones jutted from its flesh and into the open air, like dark spires of power. Mishra passed to the next mirror. Here was but a single, unchanging figure. Its flesh was black lizard skin broken by the sharp bones that erupted from its flesh. Its face was narrow and wolf-like, and its open mouth was filled with razor-sharp teeth. Its eyes were closed, and atop its head a great pair of antelope horns reached impossibly backward. Around the horns was a nest of worm-like coils buried in the creature's skull. They streamed backward like blood-colored tresses. Mishra stared at the creature in the dark mirror for a long time, waiting for it to change to another shape. But it remained an inert thing of black stone. Then the statue opened its eyes, and Mishra took a step back. They were living eyes, soft, wet, leaking blood at the edges. The eyes blinked, and the brow above them furrowed. Suddenly Mishra was aware that he was watching not an image, but a living thing. And, worse yet, that thing was watching him. The being raised a hand and touched his chest. Mishra mirrored the action, touching his own chest. His fingers brushed against something smooth, and he looked down. Mounted in the center of his chest was a great gem, radiating a spectrum of colors. Forgetting the creature for a moment, he reached up and pulled the gemstone from his breast. It felt warm to the touch, almost comforting. The great jewel was carved in glittering facets around half of its surface, but along one side a large piece had been broken off, leaving a ragged juncture behind. A creature reached up and touched its side of the mirror. Despite himself, Mishra felt his own hand raise in response, as if he were the image and the creature now the original. He pressed his hand forward, almost touching the glass itself. The demon of metal, bone, and leather smiled. Someone called his name. He was sure of it. Someone behind him called his name. He turned away from the mirror, from the dark creature behind it, suddenly caught up in a wave of brilliant white light, and woke on the floor of the chamber. He was clutching half of the power stone in his hand. In the distance, Mishra heard the tromp of metal feet against stone. Terisiare stumbled toward the two brothers, who were slowly pulling themselves from the ground. Whatever they had done, the huge power stone had split in twain, and each brother held a portion of it. Unlike other cleaved stones, Terisiare had found it. The dig site, these gems retained their lambents and energy. They flickered with the power that still remained within. Each gem flashed with a range of colors, though Urza's shone most often red, while Mishra's glowed heavily green. Terisiare blinked and realized it was brighter in the chamber. A crystal plates along the ceiling were lighter now, and there were more flashes along the metal-plated walls. Urza was already at Mishra's side. The younger brother shrugged off his elder's offer of aid and stood on his own. He rocked slightly as he stood, as if his legs were new things to him. Urza's face was as pale as a ghost's, the colors of the fractured power stone playing across it. "What happened?" he gasped. Terisiare looked at the two brothers. They seemed woozy but relatively intact. "The power gem exploded," she said. "You've got the fragments." Mishra pointed at his brother. "It was his fault. I was trying to stop you." Urza snapped. "Enough!" shouted Terisiare, her voice echoing off the walls. "Listen." Both young men stopped for a moment and heard the slow, rhythmic tread of metal feet against stone. Numerous and uniform. The footsteps were heavy and relentless. And they were getting closer. Shapes appeared at the far end of the chamber. Terisiare did not remember a door being there before the explosion, perhaps. There hadn't been. There was an opening now, she realized, and through it came a half-dozen titanic shapes. Suchi, the guardians of the Thran, with their lupine faces and backward-mounted knees. For all their hulking, twisted structure, they could move fast, though. They bore down on the trio. "Flee!" shouted Terisiare. "No," said Urza. "I think I can handle this." His gem seemed to glow bright as he spoke, and he held the bauble in front of him. A single beam of ruby light shone from the edges of the stone and lanced across the room, bathing the six oversized mechanisms. They hesitated, drinking in the radiance. Then they moved forward again. "They're moving faster," shouted Terisiare. "Whatever you did made them stronger." "Then we flee," said Urza. Mishra raised his own stone, but Urza slapped his brothers. "Arm down. We tried it, and it doesn't work. Don't make matters worse." He ran, following Terisiare. Mishra raced behind them. All the stairs that they had descended were like cliffs now, to be climbed again. Terisiare felt her muscles strain and cry out with each flight, and her bones felt as if they were made of stone. By the end of the third set of stairs, Terisiare was leaning on Urza's shoulder for support. The Suchi were slower on the steps, but the creatures took them two at a time and were untiring. Takesha glanced over her shoulder. The Suchi were catching up with them. At the top of the steps, Mishra stopped, panting. Urza was in little better shape, and Takesha felt as if she was going to pass out. Perhaps we can find something to push down. Block their path, wheezed Urza. Mishra held up his stone again, but Urza shook his head. Exhausted. Doesn't work. Makes them stronger. Tried that. Mishra was panting as well, but he forced his words out. You tried with your stone. Let me try mine. Urza let out a shout, but the younger brother was faster. He raised the stone before him, and its rays arched down the steps. The light from this gem did not pass through the air in straight lines, rather it bent in arching curves tinged with a greenish glow. The light struck the lead Suchi in mid-stride as it was climbing a step. The artifact, vigorous and healthy a moment before, now sagged noticeably as if the vitality had been suddenly leached from it. It bent forward on the step. The creature behind it was taken by surprise and slipped backward, taking two more with it as it fell. The three collapsed in a pile on the landing, and only two of the figures rose again. Didn't stop them, gasped Urza. Told you. Slowed them down, snapped Mishra. Fight later, said Takesha, clutching the front of her robes. Run now. Takesha's chest felt as if it was on fire as they fled back down the corridors. Without side passages, there was little chance of getting lost or of hiding. The crystalline plates along the ceiling were all illuminated, casting odd shadows as the explorers ran. Perhaps that was part of the guarding system for the Thran themselves, thought the old scholar. When someone entered and used the machines, the lights came on and the Suchi were roused from the slumber. In the alcoves they passed, Takesha glimpsed other Thran artifacts. The machines struggled to mobilize themselves as well, but the passage of time was too great for them. A metal arm raised in mute protest as Urza, Mishra and Takesha passed. A lupine head of dark blue metal spun toward them and hissed. At one point, the lower torso of a Suchi, back with knees and all, lurched from its alcove, bereft of an upper body. Urza pushed Takesha behind him, but Mishra brought his stone up. A jade green lancet of power arced forward, and the remains of the creature exploded, the legs falling in different directions. They ran past the metal corpse. In the back of her mind, Takesha discovered a moment of regret that they had not the time to examine the creature more thoroughly. The pursuing Suchi were out of sight, but the old scholar could still hear the clattering tread, the whir of the mechanisms within the chests, and the clank of their joints. Ahead there was another growing brightness, this one natural. They had reached the entrance and were safe. Urza held out an arm across the passage, catching both Takesha and Mishra, who let out a low curse. The older brother pointed with his other hand to the entrance. A shadow moved across the sand in front of the cavern's mouth. Something large was waiting for them. Takesha looked back for a sign of the pursuing Suchi as both brothers crept forward. The rock was perched directly above the upper of the cavern, like an owl waiting above a rodent's hole for its prey to appear. Urza cursed. Let me try, said Mishra, holding out his stone. This time, Urza did not stop him. Mishra edged forward to get a clear shot at the rock with his stone. Urza stayed directly behind him. Mishra held his half of the gem aloft, and the greenish arcing light visible even in the daylight outside, burst forward and streaked up toward the rock. The great bird let out a tremendous shriek. It took to flight, fluttering about 100 yards away to a large rocky spur, where it settled again. The greenish rays followed it but did no additional damage. "Fall, damn you! Fall!" muttered Mishra through clenched teeth. "You're weakening it," said Urza, "but it's too big to fall. Too tough." "Company coming," said Terisiare briefly. Far off in the distance was the clatter of the approaching Suchi. Between the desert and the deep, briny sea. Mishra quoted an old desert saying. Urza stared at the remains of the metal spiders nested there. Foot of the hill. Mishra, take Terisiare and run for the ornithopter. Don't stop running until you get there. But the rock, began Mishra. Let the rock be my problem, said Urza and leapt forward into the sunlight. Terisiare protested, but Mishra had already grabbed her by the wrist and pulled her after him. Mishra's fingers were like a vice around her arm, and she had little choice but to follow. The lights behind them already reflected off the blue metal of the Suchi's skulls. The rock was aloft as soon as Urza appeared, swooping back on titanic wings to its perch over the cavern's mouth. Its vulture-like beak snaked down to snare the young man, but Urza was too fast for it. In a moment he was among the remnants of the bronze spider things that littered the base of the cliff. Terisiare was half-guided, half-dragged by Mishra toward the ornithopter. Halfway there they dodged behind a large boulder for cover. Two pairs of eyes looked around the boulder's edge for any sign of Urza. "What is that fool doing?" whispered Mishra. They saw Urza dart among the half-buried wreckage of the spiders, then disappear. Terisiare put her hand to her chest and caught her breath. Urza was among the wrecked bronze metal spiders. She saw his half of the stone seemed to function differently than Mishra's gem. "He's going." She stopped and gulped. Her mouth felt as if it were lined with metal. "He's going to try to get one of those spiders to work. But why?" The rest of her statement was lost in a titanic throbbing hum from beneath their feet, and one of the reddish-gold spiders lurched from its sandy tomb. The sand poured away from it like water, and Terisiare saw that the spider's armor was shredded in a half-dozen places and was missing most of its forward legs. Through the peeled side plates she could see Urza frantically pulling levers and pressing buttons. There was a reddish glow around him, giving the steam that poured out of the beast's sides a hellish aura. "He's powering it with the stone," said Mishra. "He's fitted his stone into the machine. It must make artifacts stronger." "No. The stone's in his hand," corrected Terisiare. "But you're right. He's using that stone to make the machine more powerful, to enhance whatever power it has." "Whatever," grunted Mishra, pointing toward the opening. "He's running out of time. Look." At the entrance to the cavern were the remaining Suchi, lurching into the sunlight. The turret on the back of the spider's back gave a high-pitched metallic rasp as it spun on grit-filled cogs and brought about the long, dangerous-looking barrel. Terisiare knew at once it was a weapon. The rock screeched and leapt forward to pit the tasty morsel from its shell like a seagull eating a crab. Terisiare heard Urza shout something unintelligible, and the barrel spat flame. The resounding thunder of the weapon as it fired rattled through the canyon of coilos. The flame caught the rock in the center of its chest, igniting its feathers and engulfing its body in flames. The great winged beast tried to fly, but the fire was insidious, creeping along the rock's wings and setting them alight as the creature raised them. For an instant the rock became the phoenix of Phalange, legend bathed in flame. But instead of rising like the mythical bird, the rock fell, plummeting to the canyon floor below. The great bird fell directly in front of the cavern mouth, where the Suchi now stood. The weakened creatures had time to look up, and Takesha heard a sharp metallic whining noise that might have been a scream. Then the massive body of the flaming rock smashed down on them, crushing them utterly. There was another screech, this one sharper, more high-pitched. It came from the rusted and torn metal spider with which Urza had defeated their opponents. The steam that had surrounded the craft now became black smoked flames, and sparks licked the craft's framework. Urza had climbed loose of the device and was running. Takesha noticed he cradled the reddish gem against his chest. The whining noise from the spider became higher. It reached a pitch that almost split Takesha's brain. Then, with a crescendo of thunder, the metal spider exploded. The noise of the blast reverberated from the cliff sides and was answered a few seconds later by echoes farther up the canyon. Urza staggered up to the others. Takesha checked the cavern's entrance, but all that was visible was the smoking remains of the rock. "That takes care of that," said Urza. His face and hair were streaked with soot, and he smelled of burnt leather and metal. "You were lucky," said Mishra with a frown. "We all were lucky," said Takesha. "Lucky to find this place. Lucky to escape the rock. Lucky to escape the caverns without perishing. Now let us be sufficiently lucky to get back home." "You were lucky," repeated Mishra to his brother. "Luck had nothing to do with it," replied Urza, a surly note in his voice. "I thought I knew what those spider things did, and I had the power to make a difference. It was fast planning, perhaps, but not luck." "You had no idea," pressed Mishra. "You accidentally made the Guardians stronger with the power of the stone." "One learned from one's mistakes," said Urza, shrugging. "At least I do. You keep making new mistakes all the time." "Boys," cautioned Takesha, "this isn't the time for this. I beat the Suchi with my stone," snapped Mishra. "You blew up the crystal in the first place," riposted Urza. "I did not. I didn't touch anything," yelled Mishra. "That was you." "Hold!" shouted Takesha, stepping between the two young men. "We can argue about this once we get aloft. For the moment we need to repair the ornithopter and get back." She motioned with her head toward the smoldering remains of the rock. "We don't know if that bird was solitary or one of a larger family." Takesha turned away from the pair. She wondered if there was something among the debris she could use as a walking stick. In the flight from the caverns she had lost hers, and she could feel the muscles in her legs cramping from overuse. She looked forward to a long rest after this adventure. Behind her, neither of the brothers moved. Takesha turned and said, "Today, if you don't mind." Both brothers, she noticed, looked as if steam were going to pour from their ears. "In a moment," said Urza finally. "But first, give." He held out his right hand. His left still clutched the red glowing gem. "What?" asked Mishra, holding his own stone to his chest. "The stone," returned Urza. "Give it to me. Perhaps we can fit the pieces back together." Mishra held the stone tighter, and Terisiare could swear she saw the stone flicker as yellow-green as a cat's eyes in his hand. "No," he said. His face was set in a deep scowl. "There is a chance that we can restore it," said Urza crossly. "Good," snapped Mishra. "Give me yours." Urza's face grew longer. "I can't. You might break it." "I don't break things," said Mishra hotly. His voice was shrill. To Terisiare it seemed on the verge of breaking, as it had done several years before during his adolescence. "You're the one who always thinks you know everything," he continued, "but you always blame me. Well, you're not as smart as you think you are. Everyone knows that." "I know better because I'm older," said Urza coldly. "Then you know I don't want to give up my stone," retorted his brother. "If you want to fit it together, give me yours. Master High and Mighty too good for the rest of us. Show me you're all-wise, brother. Give me your stone." "You want it?" snarled Urza. "Fine. Take it, then. You always take things that aren't yours." Terisiare started to shout, but it was too late. Urza's hand lashed out, the stone still gripped tightly in his fist. Mishra stepped forward directly into Urza's punch. The gem connected with the younger brother's forehead and he went down in a heap. Urza leapt forward, kneeling over the fallen form of his brother. "I'm sorry, Mishra. I didn't mean to hit you." Mishra had already pushed himself up on his elbows and was trying to back away. "Get away from me, damn you." Terisiare pulled on Urza's shoulder. "Get up. You should know better," she snarled. Her temper was frayed to the breaking point. "You're always saying you're the older and smarter one," she rapped out. "Well, look what you've done." Urza started to speak, then looked at his brother. The gem had cut Mishra's face, and crimson blood already welled in there, wound at his temple. Urza looked at Terisiare again. I'm sorry," he stammered. He held out his empty hand to Mishra. "I didn't mean to. I'm sorry." Mishra lashed out, knocking away Urza's hand. "Go away. I don't need your help." Terisiare started to speak. "Now, Mishra, your brother is just trying, and I don't need you to explain things away for him." That Mishra interrupted. "I'll be fine." He turned to his brother. "The stone is mine. You have one of your own." Terisiare felt her insides melting with anger. Both young men were stupid, pig-headed fools. She had no time for this. She breathed heavily, controlling her temper by an active will. "Fine," she said at last. "Urza, you tend to the strut on the ornithopter. Mishra, check the remains of the rock to see if any of the Suchi guardians survived. Shout if any do." Neither brother moved, and Terisiare put steel in her voice. "Now, children." Both turned to the tasks, but Terisiare noticed that each glowered at the other as if they were rival dogs. The trip back to Terisiare's camp was made in moody silence, and they flew into the night to avoid having to camp again. Neither brother spoke more than 3 words at a time to the other. They confined themselves to practical subjects such as the way the damaged wing was handling, the weather ahead, and the present course of the ornithopter. Neither spoke about the secret heart of the Thran, the rock, or their fight. Terisiare realized that more than the power stone had been shattered that day. Chapter 5. Sundering. The world changed after Koilos and became a darker place in the months that followed. Urza retreated to the quarters he shared with his brother as soon as the three investigators returned to the camp, emerging only for meals. Soon after, Mishra moved out of those quarters, taking a tent among the diggers. He could have taken permanent housing among the students, but Terisiare felt the young man was making a statement both to his brother and to her. The two brothers sniped at each other continually now. Urza noted publicly that Mishra had instructed the students to dig too deep. Mishra shot back that Urza was demanding more students to clean the artifacts than he truly needed. Mealtimes were particularly stressful. The arguments were no longer exchanges of wordplay and ideas. An edge of steel, like the blade of a dagger, had slipped into the boys' conversations. Questions now seemed like barbed hooks, and answers held hints of threat and challenge. A few times Mishra blew up at his brother at the table, and after a month Urza stopped attending the communal dinners at all, instead taking his meals in his quarters. He had apparently used Mishra's half of the room to expand his own workspace, which irritated his brother all the more. Mishra appeared at dinner for a month beyond that, brooding over the meals. Then he began to dine in the diggers' camp. Neither brother spoke of personal matters, not to Terisiare or anyone else. To the old scholar they were polite and tried to keep the conversation focused on the nature of the excavations for Mishra, or on the latest reassembled marvel for Urza. When the subject of the caverns came up, however, both young men would turn taciturn and abrupt. In part, Terisiare felt it was the stones that had altered their relationship. Urza had fitted to a claw-like clasp of gold, and wore it about his neck on a chain. Mishra too wore his around his neck, but in a small leather sag dangling from a thong in the manner of the Phalange talismans. Terisiare did not know if the shattered power stone had created the anger within her two best students, or merely unearthed and crystallized resentments that had fermented for years. Soon after Koilos, she went to each and asked to examine the stones themselves, seeking to unlock the mystery. Urza refused to give up his stone. Instead, he said he wanted to examine it himself. Surely Terisiare trusted him to make a fair and rational examination. What he did not say, though, Terisiare sensed it, was that he was afraid she would turn over the stone to his brother. Mishra would play on the old scholar's feelings. He was the younger brother, therefore Terisiare would give Mishra a chance to examine both halves of the stone. Mishra in turn would not give up his stone. If Urza kept his half of the stone, he said contemptuously, he would hold his as well. What he did not say, but what Terisiare felt, was that he was afraid she would turn over the stone to his brother. Urza would appeal to her reasoning. Urza was the elder brother, therefore Terisiare would give Urza the chance to examine both halves of the stone. The archaeologist was thoroughly frustrated. Neither brother would move without the other, neither trusted her sufficiently to let her examine the gems. She turned to the other stones, both the flickering fragments that still held some power and the dull, cracked remains that had lost their energies. There was nothing there. None of the other power stones they had discovered had similar powers. Mishra's stone seemed to induce weakness in its targets, whether living or artificial. Urza's gem apparently strengthened its targets and, in fact, allowed the spark of animation to enter the barest of mechanical husks. No other stones, Terisiare noted sadly, seemed to have encourage such avarice and anger in their possessors. The nature of the energy itself continued to elude Terisiare. She knew it existed and that it could be harnessed by the devices, using the Thran designs they had deciphered. Yet the nature of that energy was beyond her. What was it, and how did it come into being? Was it natural to the crystals, or was it something the Thran had entrapped there? The questions were there, but not their answers, and her own failure to answer darkened Terisiare's mood. Further, to be fair, the black mood in the camp was not all the brothers doing, at least not directly. More phalangy than Armel had expected were offended by the fact that the archaeologist and her colleagues had found the secret heart of the Thran. Diggers abandoned the camp in droves. Old Armel was clearly embarrassed by this turn of events, since he had assured Terisiare that few of his people would be scared away by ancient legends of the long-dead Thran. Indeed, as word of the discovery of Koilos spread, the flow of artifacts recovered by the desert people, so abundant in previous years, dried up almost entirely. Part of that drought was caused by an increase in desert raids. A number of tribes such as the Suwardi, quiet for decades, were more active now. They raided merchant caravans and even struck into Argive itself. The school had not been attacked, owing to its own group of native phalangy, but it was only a matter of time, Terisiare felt. Armel agreed. There are numbers beyond numbers of families, tribes, and clans among the phalangy, he said one evening, 10 months after Koilos. They sat beneath Terisiare's tarp, sipping nabbers. Most of the rest of the camp had gone to bed. The only lamps still burning were from Urza's quarters, and those had been dimmed. The brazier between Terisiare and Armel crackled low. The phalangy spread his fingers and ticked off a roster of tribal names: the wealthy Muiharan, the once mighty Gestost, and my own tribe, the Thaladin, he said. There are others like the Tomikul, who have the nearest thing you Outlander people would think of as a city. The Tomikul claim general rulership over the others, but they're not the true masters of the various tribes either. The clans follow strong leaders, so for one generation, everyone followed the Gestos because they had a wise leader. For the next they followed the Muiharan because the Muiharan had a great warrior as their leader. And now the desert people follow a new tribe, said Terisiare, bitterly, sipping at her nabbis. She took it hot in the desert style, but never cared for the cinnamon. The Suwardi, agreed Armel. They moved in from the southwestern lands when I was a boy, from the area bordering the Outlander state of Yosha. They have a Kadir, a leader who has gained many allies. He talks of the old times when the phalangy people were powerful, and he fans resentment against the coastal nations, particularly those that are spreading into phalangy lands. Are these Suwardi your leaders now? Asked Terisiare. Armel shrugged. Not like your kings and warlords and nobles. Our leaders. My people put great value in respect. They respect the Suwardi for what they have accomplished and therefore listen to their message. Many worry about the coastal nations moving inland, taking land from the traditional phalangy grounds. Many worry about the discoveries we are making. We are discovering things for everyone, said Terisiare flatly. That I agree with, returned Armel. And I thought others would agree as well. But they see the artifacts they bring into trade, as well as the ones we dig up, move eastward to Argive, southeast to Koilos, or south to Yosha. They worry what great and wondrous things are being lost to them. And these Suwardi play on that worry, concluded Terisiare. They gather power by creating a common threat, whether one is truly present or not. Amal nodded and said dryly, "You are familiar with the process." Terisiare laughed and took a long pull on her nabbies. Basic Argivian politics. The kings of Argive have survived for years on that principle, playing one faction against another. They do things in Pendragon that would make your head spin. At least they're Phalangi are honest about being someone's enemy. That is why we have not moved, and should not move, the base camp to Koilos, said Amal. The only way into the canyon where the caverns are found is through the deep desert, Terisiare began. The deep desert is held by the Suwardi tribe and their allies. Word has gone out that any non-Phalangi found in their lands will be considered Suwardi property, to be disposed of as they see fit. Terisiare spread her hands and looked at the wooden surface beneath her wrinkled fingers. The desert had practically won its battle with the great Argivian table. It was wobbly and brittle. Now, the last of its pearl inlay had surrendered to the differences in temperature and to the dust. Soon she would have to break it up for firewood. Terisiare had not realized how much she would miss the table, both as a level space and as a reminder of distant Pendragon. Would they have had this problem with the tribesmen had Urza not been so brilliant with maps and calculations, or Mishra so close to the desert tribes and their legends? Terisiare shook her head. The past was the past, as inviolate as the rocks from which she and her followers pulled the thread devices, as solid as the metals they carefully pieced together in the workshops. A silence grew between her and Amal. The only sound was the crackle of the brazier. "You are not thinking of the desert tribes or your dig site," said Amal at last. "You are thinking of your two young men." Terisiare let the silence continue, then said, "They have been fighting again ever since they visited the secret heart of the Old Ones," said Amal. Terisiare shot the leader of the diggers a look and he held up a hand. "No, they did not tell me what happened there. No one tells this old digger anything. But it is clear to me and to everyone else that they have had a great falling out. The kind of battle that brothers do not recover from. Last week they almost came to blows at the dig site." He shot her a sidelong glance. "You know." Terisiare nodded. Urza thought Mishra was digging too deep to find any parts for an onulet. When the diggers found such parts, Urza all but accused Mishra of planting the find there in the trench. Mishra found the pieces of that onulet's shoulder mounting fairly, said Amal. But then he drove the diggers on into the heat of midday, when we normally nap. He would have been happy with nothing less than a complete onulet arising from the earth, fully formed and alive, just to prove his brother wrong. Terisiare nodded. Each day they get worse, and neither wants to talk to the other about it. Whenever they are in the same place, the conversation breaks down into argument. Then each continues arguing with me afterward, trying to show me where the other was wrong. And when I try to show them that they may be wrong, each acts as if I've sided with the other. The past few months have been the worst of all the years I have known them. Amal leaned forward. The Phalangi believe that man is made of stone and fire, sky and water. The perfect man holds all these elements in balance. The young brother, he had more fire than he needed on the first day I met him, and he has more fire than he needs now. The older brother is consumed by stone, cold and unyielding. Unable to bend, he will shatter or be worn away. The Argivians have a similar belief, though few follow it. These days, said Terisiare, the world is divided into reality and dreams. The old temple priests of Argive would say that both those young men have been consumed by the dreams and are forgetting their reality. Amel grunted. Does Urza speak of dreams to you? Terisiare shook her head. Urza speaks to no one anymore. Not to me, not his brother. She looked at the leader of the diggers. Does Mishra? Amel nodded. Not to me, but he does speak to Haja, one of my younger assistants, who is closer to him in age and temperament. Haja has been bitten hard by the fire as well, and he dreams of being a great warrior. I fear we will lose him to the Suwardian soon. But Mishra has told Haja, who has told me. And I tell you that Mishra has dreams. If what? Asked Terisiare, pouring herself more nabis. Darkness, said Amel, spreading his fingers out to catch the warmth of the brazier. He says there is darkness out there. A darkness that sings to him and tries to draw him to it. It tugs at him like a jackal hanging onto his trouser legs. And he fears it. He said that, prompted Terisiare. Amel shrugged. Mishra talks to Haja. Haja talks to me. I talk to you. Each time someone talks to another, things are added, other things forgotten. Perhaps you should ask him yourself. He probably would not tell Haja, I am afraid of my dreams, but Mishra does sleep in the diggers' camp, and everyone knows he sometimes awakens in the middle of the night, shouting at things that are not there. Terisiare was silent for a moment. She could not say if Mishra had done this before Koilos, when Mishra and Urza were quartered together, but Urza had never said anything about the matter. Nor had Urza spoken of his own dreams, if indeed he had any. You know, they each took something with them when they left Koilos? Asked Terisiare. The gems of power, replied Amel. They look like the ones that you say move the old ones' machines. Each of the young masters has one. Yet each man keeps his stone close to himself at all times. Could the stones be responsible? Queried Terisiare. Could their energies be causing the young men to act like this? Amel shrugged, and Terisiare added, do you know what their stones can do? Mishra has not talked to me of the matter, said Amel flatly. Perhaps to Haja, but he let the words hang in the hot desert air for a long moment. Urza's gem makes things stronger, said the scholar. He called it his might stone. Mishra seems to have the opposite effect. Urza has named it the weak stone. Amel chortled. That probably does not sit well with the younger brother to have the weaker stone. It doesn't, said Terisiare. Urza knows it, so he calls it that to Mishra's face. What does Mishra call it? Asked Amel. Terisiare thought a moment. I've never heard him refer to it as one thing or another. It's his Mishra's stone, and the other one is his Urza's stone. That sounds right, observed Amel. The older brother always had a tendency to name things, to identify them. It makes them his, I suppose. Terisiare sighed. All these years they have been with us, she said, and they remain as great a mystery as the energy within those power crystals, as the Thran themselves. The Thran, the old ones, you and I will understand Eventually, replied Amel. For they have the good sense to stay dead. The living, they keep changing as time goes along. It is harder to climb upon a moving mound. Old Phalange saying. Terisiare raised her cup. Old digger saying, said Amel, returning the salute. From this old digger in particular, the conversation moved to other subjects, such as the new layer of hard sandstone they had encountered at the second site, and whether Bligh would need additional outriders for his caravan, and how much he would try to charge Terisiare for them. Finally, Amel made farewells and left the top. The night was pleasant, and Terisiare knew she would probably sleep sitting up in her camp chair, wrapped in a soft fur from dwarven sardia. Amel slowly walked through the camp. The fires had been banked, and the lamps had all been extinguished. Even the lamps from Urza's quarters, usually the last to be doused, were now darkened. The old digger stood in the center of the camp and looked upward at the stars. The moons had not risen yet, and above the old Phalange the sky pinwheeled in a heavy scattering of stars. Amel tried to imagine if the sky over the far-off coastal cities looked this beautiful, and decided against it. Fires burned long and wastefully into the night there, obscuring the sky with the smoke. So much like city peoples everywhere. There was a movement to his left and the sound of a sandal scraping against the dirt. Slowly Amel turned toward the noise, keeping his head raised toward the stars but allowing his eyes to sweep the shadows. The moonless night was dark but not dark enough to foil the sharp eyes of the Phalange. There was a rustle along the shadowed side of one of the student barracks. Then came a soft, muffled cough. Someone there, called Amel, suddenly looking directly at the shadow. Show yourself, shadowy one, or I'll wake the camp. A lean form stepped from the shadows, dressed in dark linen. Thin and wiry, Amel recognized Haja, chief among his assistants. The young Phalange smiled guiltily, his teeth filling his narrow face. It was a beautiful night, and I could not sleep, he said. I thought I would go for a walk. Amel smiled. It is a beautiful night, and I have been walking myself, he said. Let us stroll back together. The old digger turned away, but Haja did not move from his position. Are you coming? Amel asked, then added with a smile, or are you not alone? To the shadows behind Haja he said, you can come out now as well. Amel had expected Haja's companion to be one of the noble girl students entrusted to Terisiare. Such romances, though officially frowned upon, were common enough, and Amel still remembered his own youth well enough to know all the justifications and excuses one makes in such situations. A stern lecture and a word to Terisiare to keep an eye on the Argivian girl was all that usually resulted from such a discovery. Amel was thus surprised when the figure who stepped from the shadows was not a young woman but the familiar, broad-shouldered form of Mishra. Amel's smile turned to puzzlement, and the old digger said, Good evening, young master. Are you enjoying the beautiful night? Mishra smiled, and even in the starlight Amel could see it was a thin, inconsequential smile. I needed to fetch something from Urza's from my old quarters, he said. I brought Haja along to help. I see, said Amel cautiously, and this something was so critical that you needed to fetch it now, in the dead of night, when even your brother would be asleep. Yes, said Mishra. The young man seemed to be turning the idea over in his mind a few times, then apparently he decided to stick with it. His back straightened, and he said again, "Yes. Something important. Do you doubt me?" By this time Amel had closed the distance between himself and the pair. He could smell the odor of desert wine on him. It was more powerful than on himself. "Not at all, young Master Mishra," said Amel. "And this something is so heavy you need a second man, or perhaps a third to carry it." "Yes," said Mishra, then, perhaps feeling he'd given too much away, corrected himself. "No. Not really. Haja is here more for company." "Ah," said Amel. "Well, I have a need for Haja. If you can spare him, he can run an errand for me." Mishra's face clouded, and Amel wondered if the lad would continue alone or merely abandon his task. It was obvious he was heading for his brothers, and Amel thought it likely the younger brother planned to confront Urza with an argument. The youth had obviously taken his courage from a wineskin, a time-consuming task that accounted for the late hour. Mishra gave another thin smile. "Of course. If you need Haja for some matter, I can gladly do without him." "A small matter," said Amel. "I could use the help. But I tell you again, I don't think your brother is awake. His lamps are out." Mishra shook his head. "Sometimes my brother lies awake in the darkness and plots into the night. I would be surprised if he were truly asleep." Amel raised his hands in mock surrender. "As you say. You know him better than I. Come, Haja. I have work for you." The wiry Falaji crossed toward Amel, and the older man turned. The pair started back toward the diggers' camp. Amel looked back. Mishra had already melted back into the shadows. "So why were you there, Haja?" The narrow-faced youth scowled in the starlit darkness. "I do not know if I can tell you." "We are Falaji," said the older man. "If I cared to find out, I could show that your mother's family and my mother's family shared a common mother. Come out with it. What were you up to, stinking of nabbers and slinking through the shadows like jackals?" The younger Falaji stopped, as clearly motion and moral thought did not work simultaneously. Amel waited. At last the youth said, "Young Master Mishra was angry." "Angry at Urza?" asked Amel. The shadow nodded in the darkness. "About how Master Urza was always picking on him, was always showing him up. How his brother was trying to trick him out of his stone. And finally he got drunk enough and angry enough to do something about it," finished Amel. The narrow shadow shrugged. "Yes, that was it," thought Amel. "Wake your brother up in the middle of the night to finish an argument from 3 days before. Get all your thoughts lined up. Soak them with alcohol, and set them on fire. If he was planning for Urza to be awake when he got there." A nasty thought crystallized in Amel's mind. Perhaps the younger brother was indeed going to Urza's to retrieve something. The thought sent a small chill up the old digger's spine. Quickly, he said to Haja, "I have an errand for you after all. Go up to Takasha's top. She should be sleeping there in a chair. Wake her. Tell her what you told me, and tell her to meet me at the brothers' at Master Urza's quarters." Haja hesitated. "I don't think," he started. Amel hissed. "You've had too much to drink to be trusted with thinking, lad. I tell you to fetch Mistress Takasha and fetch her Yule, or the next trench you dig will be for the student's privy. Now off with you." The sharpness of the words cut like a knife through Haja's drunken confusion. Very much awake and alert, the lad moved quickly toward the rocky outcropping where Terisiare kept her tent. Amel shook his head and quickly made for the cabin where Urza and Mishra had grown up. It was a heavy, squat thing made of rough-hewn timbers, with a grey slate roof, unequally outdoor, and candle-waxed paper windows sealed it against the desert dust. Comfortable for one, thought Amel. Suitable for two young boys. And tight for two young men. Impossibly so for two young men who were angry at each other. A lamp now glowed through the windows, so if burglary was Mishra's intent, it had been foiled. There were voices as well, sharp and argumentative. As Amel approached the cabin, the voices were loud to his hearing, but indistinct. Mishra's voice was a drunken bellow, while that of Urza's had a sharp, nasty twang. Amel stood across the path from the cabin's doorway. Unless something or someone came flying out the door, he decided the best course of action would be to wait, at least to wait for Mistress Terisiare. The sun spread, other lamps were coming on from the barracks and quarters of the older students. If young Master Mishra was hoping for a private argument, Amel mused, he had been denied that as well. Now Urza was shouting. All Amel could make out were cries of thief and liar. Terisiare arrived, accompanied by Haja. The young Falaji took stock of the situation and immediately disappeared in a puff of night air, heading back to the diggers' tents. He would no doubt to spread the word that the two brothers were finally having it out. Terisiare seemed groggy, as if suddenly awakened. She ran her fingers through her short graying hair. Why haven't you stopped them? She asked Amel. I haven't heard any furniture breaking, returned the older man. Even then, we should wait a bit longer. This fight has been brewing for months between these two. They need to get it out of the systems. There was the sound of glass breaking within the quarters. Terisiare took a step toward the cabin's front door, but Amel held out an arm. Every time the boys fight, someone breaks up the argument, he said. Let them go on. They may get some cuts and bruises, but they need to sort things out their way. The shouting was almost incoherent now, more like barking wild dogs than the sound of human voices. There was another crash, this time of something heavy. Most of the students had gathered out in front of the cabin, and some of the diggers had arrived with Haja. Then there was a new glow visible through the windows. The golden radiance of the lamp was joined, then overwhelmed by beacons of red and green. Amel lowered his arm. He had never seen such colors before. From a lamp. He wondered if the brawl had started a fire. Suddenly the idea of letting the two young men pummel each other into understanding did not seem as wise as it had a moment before. The stones, said Terisiare, her voice dry with fear. They are using the stones against each other. The Thranstones? Asked Amel, but he was speaking to empty air. The ancient scholar was already running for the door. A moment later Amel followed her, waving the others to stay back. Terisiare was through the door first, Amel hot on her heels. The Falaji smelled smoke and noticed small scorch marks burned along the interior of the room, though there were no outright fires. The brothers were at opposite ends of the room. Each clutched his stone. Urza's flickered with red bolts of flame, while Mishra's radiated lances of greenish light. The bolts met in the center, almost as if physical arms grappled with one another, each color trying to overwhelm the other. The display of power was taking its toll on the brothers. Mishra was sweating like a winded horse, blood streamed from his nostrils. Urza's face was a rictus of concentration and pain, and he too was bleeding from the nose. Mishra was slightly crouched, while his brother stood haughty and erect. Each clung to his power stone with both hands. The room itself had been affected by the bolts of might and weakness. It was hot in the cabin. The air shimmered with the song of power, a rising, throbbing noise that grew louder each moment. Neither young man would yield, and the space between them glowed brighter by the moment. Terisiare raised her hands and shouted something Armel did not understand. Neither brother paid the slightest attention, so intent were they on their private duel. Terisiare cried out again, and stepped forward into the bands of red and green, her hands raised as if she were trying to physically silence the boys and the gems. Armel joined her cry himself and leapt forward, but he was too late. Terisiare broke one of the ruby-green, jade-red beams. As one, both brothers stared up at her. The concentrations slipped, their lancing beams suddenly sprayed in all directions, and the room exploded. Armel felt himself physically lifted by the blast and thrown backward, out where the door should have been. The blast blew away all four of the walls and most of the roof and showered the observers outside with splinters and flaming chunks of wood. Armel realized he was looking at the stars again. They spun gently above his upturned face. Slowly he pulled himself to his feet, feeling something soft give in his left knee. The old digger grimaced and pulled himself up. There were moans around him from the wounded onlookers and shouts from those attending them. He had not heard the noise a moment before and wondered if he had gone deaf for a moment from the blast. There were more torches now, he saw, and someone had lit a bonfire. Armel staggered to his feet and saw the remains of the old cabin. It was almost entirely destroyed, only one corner still standing. The entire perimeter was smoking, framing the forms within. There were two, kneeling over a third. Armel limped into the wreckage of the cabin. Terisiare's form lay on Urza's lap, while Mishra knelt at her side. She lay like a broken doll, her neck canted at an odd angle to her body. Mishra held his fingers to her neck, then looked up at Armel. The younger brother shook his head. Urza looked up as well, ignoring Armel and glaring at his younger brother. It was a hate-filled stare that blazed through the tears streaming down his cheeks. Armel could not remember Urza ever crying in all the time the young man had been in the camp. But beneath the tears, the digger saw accusing fury in Urza's eyes. Mishra fell back from his brother as if he had been struck. He rose and staggered a few paces away from Terisiare's body. Urza did not move, nor did he say anything. Mishra took a step away. Then a second, and then the younger brother was running away from the shattered house and into the night. No one stopped him in his flight. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Armel laid the last of the cairnstones in place. The students had paid their respects, as well as the diggers, and Haji had volunteered to make a marker stone to commemorate her resting place. In an area littered with holes and ditches, they buried her in the rocky soil of the outcropping where her tarp had been pitched. Urza remained beside her through the entire day as the body was dressed, the prayers spoken, old Argivian invocations and Phalange chants, and the last of the stones were laid over her. Of Mishra there had been no sign, and everyone assumed he would not be seen again. Urza's face was gaunt from grief, and Amel for a moment thought the young man could be taken for older than Terisiare had been. The digger started to say something to him, but Urza held up a hand, silencing him. Amel nodded and retreated, limping on his injured knee, leaning on one of Terisiare's old staves for support. It was the afternoon of the first day after Terisiare's death. At dawn of the second day, Amel returned to find Urza in the same position, as if he had been turned to stone to serve as a statue commemorating Terisiare's passing. "Master Urza, we must talk," said Amel softly. Urza nodded. "I know. There is much to do. There is still a school to run, diggings to continue, things to take out of the ground." He said the last in a flat, toneless voice, as if it were the last thing he wanted to do. "We have things we must discuss," said Amel. "Most of the other students and diggers are all right, though a handful were injured in the blast. Nothing serious." Urza nodded, and Amel wondered if Urza had even thought of the others in the camp, or of his own minor injuries. The scrapes and bumps along his arms and neck already had nasty, dark scabs on them. Amel shook his head and forced out the words, "It would be best to send the students back to Penregan as soon as possible." Urza looked up at Amel, surprised. Awareness flickered behind the eyes, dead a few moments before. "We need to continue Terisiare's work," the young man said, stammering in his intensity. "We need to keep going." Amel sighed. The Phalange follow people more than ideas. The Phalange respected Terisiare, and so that they followed her. They might have followed your brother, who lived among them. But you, they do not know. You rarely spend time with them. They will not stay. "We can get other diggers," protested Urza, "and there are the students. We can use them. Without Phalange present here, you would be more of a target for desert raiders," Amel said. "There are increasing numbers of Phalange who do not like Argivians in what they think of as their land. You would have to bring in more men from Argive itself. Soldiers. Diggers. It is not a place for students anymore." Urza's mouth was a thin line. "I see." Amel could almost see the young man's thoughts as one conclusion led to another. "Tell me," he said finally, "am I safe here now?" Amel looked at the cairn. He had once assured Terisiare that there would be no trouble and had been wrong. He would not make a similar mistake again. "I do not think you are. The students will be safe, but there are those among my people who blame you for Terisiare's death, for Mishra's disappearance." Urza looked down. "I don't know where he is," he said softly. Then added, "I wish he'd come back." Amel nodded. "I wish he would as well." He put his hand on the young man's shoulder. Urza shuddered for a moment, unused to the touch, and shied away. The digger dropped his arm and left the young man at the cairn. A message about the disaster was sent to Penregan by Ornithopter, and the craft returned with Lauren and to Amal's surprise Riklau. The young noblewoman was to take stock of Terisiare's works and writing, while the older nobleman was to oversee the striking of the camp. A caravan was already being sent out from Penregan by worried parents, fearful that savage Desert riders were about to swoop down and slay their now unprotected children. Urza was gone by the time the evacuation caravan arrived. He had spent 2 days with Lauren summarizing Takesha's notes, then left with another, smaller caravan heading south. The young man told Lauren he had no desire to return to Pendragon. To Amal he made clear he had no desire to remain and watch his beloved camp abandoned. Of Mishra there was no sign, though Riglau ordered ornithopter patrols to try to find him from the air. If he ever returned to the camp, none saw him, or admitted to seeing him. Amal was the last to see Urza off. None of the other Phalangi wanted to be near him, and as there was no real work to do now, the diggers themselves were drifting off in 2s and 3s. The camp felt like a town of ghosts, still occupied but missing its own secret heart. That heart had died with Takesha. Amal watched from beside Takesha's cairn as the caravan, made up of friendly Phalangi, wound its way out of the camp. Urza was on foot, using one of his mentor's staves as a hiking staff. That and a few drained and cracked power stones were the only things he took from the camp. Those things and his knowledge, thought the Phalangi digger. Urza turned, looking up at where Amal stood. No, corrected the old man. He was looking at where Takesha lay. Amal was too far away to see the young man's face clearly, but he saw Urza's shoulders, dejected and defeated. Amal thought he understood. The young man had lost his mentor, his home, and his brother, all because of the actions of a single night. What Amal did not understand, and what would take years for him to understand, was which of the 3 losses was the hardest for the young scholar to bear. Part 2.